India is a leader of the global South, and I think it is vying to become the leader of the global South with China. Modi's statements, he has been surprisingly sympathetic to the Israeli situation and to American policy. Unless it broadens and we get Hezbollah or Iran into the war. I don't think that Russia or China has done anything constructive.
So hi everyone, this is Sukanya Saha and you're watching The New Indian. Our today's guest is very special. Mr. Cliff Kupchan is Eurasia Group's chairman and a leader of the firm's global macro coverage. Cliff has held high positions in the US government and regularly meets top foreign leaders. He provides cutting-edge insights on political risk and would be talking to us today about the Israel-Hamas conflict. Hi Cliff, hi, welcome to the show. So, you know that Hamas launched a terror attack on Israel on the 7th of October. And then the Israeli Prime Minister, he declared that Israel has went into a state of war. And then after that, Gaza Health Ministry so far has said that over 2,500 Palestinians have been killed and over 9,500 have been wounded, more than 1,500 Israelis have been killed, etc. So this conflict in Israel and Gaza has raised concerns in various regions, including India. So how do you see the impact of this conflict on the geopolitical landscape in South Asia and India's relationship with both Israel and Palestine?
The conflict, first, is not going to have, I don't think the conflict is going to expand significantly. Unless Iran gets involved in the war. That's the key thing to watch. Or unless the West thinks Iran was more involved in the attack than it now thinks Iran was involved. If Iran gets involved, then we're looking at a world where Iranian oil production and free passage through the Strait of Hormuz could get questioned, could become involved in the war. And that means spiking oil prices. So Iran is the transmission belt to the global economy. Iran is the transmission belt to impacts on the world, including South Asia. Otherwise, this war will be horrible. It will be very difficult to watch. It will involve a lot of killing. But it won't, in my view, affect the rest of the world immediately anyway, in significant ways. So I think the direct impact is potentially increased oil prices, which is a major importer. You could, figure that way. That's a direct impact on India. The longer term impact is that I fear that an Israeli land war, some form of which is coming, will only increase extremism, both in Palestine and throughout the world. And that will affect all countries, unfortunately, over the medium term.
So India has a significant diaspora in the Middle East, including Israel and the Palestinian territories. So how do you think India is navigating this delicate balance between supporting its citizens and maintaining diplomatic relationship with both the parties involved in the war?
India is Indian diplomacy fascinating because India is a leader of the global South, and I think it is vying to become the leader of the global South with China. And I don't have a view on where that is going, but I think India to me is a rising, I call India the leading swing state of the global South. Swing state because it's swinging kind of between the US and China, certainly closer to the US. But by all accounts is a rising power. Now, that means India has lots of equities. India traditionally has been the most non-aligned of the non-aligned. India just does not like to align. I think in this conflict, as I have read Mr. Modi's statements, he has been surprisingly sympathetic to the Israeli situation and to American policy. I think certainly more towards the US side on this issue than he's been on the war in Ukraine. I think India has to appease, well, I think it is committed to a strong relationship with Israel. It also has to be very careful about the living conditions and the impact of the war on the diaspora. So it has a lot of equities, and I think that's what India, in my view, will do. I think Modi's good at this. He's good at diplomacy.
What implications might this conflict have for India's energy security and its relationship with key oil supplies, like you mentioned earlier, key oil supplies in the region, considering the tensions between Israel and Iran?
Well, that's the key. Energy is the key equity for India that's involved in the war. I do think that if we find out, and we may, I don't think we know everything yet, that Iran is complicit in the immediate planning an attack on Israel by Hamas, or if Iran pushes Hezbollah to open a second front, then we're in a world where Israeli attacks on Iranian oil infrastructure, on Iranian military facilities, are real possibilities. And those attacks, I think, would any kind of attack like that would send insurance premiums to the Strait of Hormuz through the roof. And anybody listening to this can do the math on what that would mean for oil prices. It would be a huge spike, and that would be a problem for India. I feel a lot of budgeting that is done by the government would have to get reevaluated. So that's what's at stake here. That's what's at stake, I think, for India.
So the European Union has called for the immediate release of hostages held by the Hamas group. As a geopolitical expert, could you shed light on the implications of this conflict for global security and international efforts to combat terrorism?
Sure. And it opens a new front for international terrorism. As everybody knows, this was the bloodiest day for Israel since the Holocaust. 1,300 Jewish people were murdered. And it's important to use that word, I think, because this was not a war. This was murder. This was civilians. It wasn't soldiers that died, most of them. And how that happened is mostly an Israeli story. How Israeli intelligence fell asleep or didn't have the assets to find this out. The real question this raises for international terrorism is, Israel was known to be the best intelligence operation in the world. Mm-hmm. We all assumed that Israel knew where Hamas was sleeping, breathing, and eating. Well, we didn't. So if a state that has invested billions into monitoring activity in a small region, if that can't happen, what does that mean for international terrorism more broadly? What does this failure mean? What do we have to learn? I think that's really important. On geopolitics more broadly, I don't think that this war will have a major impact unless it broadens and we get Hezbollah or Iran into the war. I think that's how I would answer.
So the conflict in the Middle East has drawn attention of major global powers. How do you assess the role of the US and China and other influential nations in their escalating or de-escalating of the situation?
I think Biden has done a very good job so far. He and Blinken. Tony Blinken's flying around the Middle East desperately right now, trying to moderate the Israeli response, trying to moderate the Arab response, trying to work on the hostage issue, and trying to set up safe areas in Gaza and options for for Palestinians to flee into Egypt, which so far President Sisi has not agreed to. But if you just look at that agenda, it's 5 or 6 extraordinarily tough agenda items. And I think the U.S. administration has been all over this issue and is doing a good job so far. You know, I don't say this as an American. I try to speak as a political scientist, but I think, and look, I've been a quite harsh critic of the Biden administration, both on their China policy and their policy towards Ukraine. So I think even though I'm usually a harsh critic, I think I've done a great job here so far. I don't think that Russia or China has done anything constructive. Putin's Russia is by far the most revisionist state in the world, and all they kind of want to do is, throw dynamite into flammable material. And here, all I've heard is Russia trying to blame the United States for what happened, for its over support of Israel, and not be balanced at all. And it's unusual because Putin had a good relationship with Russia. And he's kind of just cast that aside and gone all in on the Palestinian side. So they're not doing much. On China, look, China is a rapidly rising power and one of the 2 superpowers in the world, in my view. But they don't have the reach to do much in a crisis like this. China has taken a pretty neutral position, more neutral than I think I would have expected, given their relationship in the region. But they just don't have the diplomatic contacts and the diplomatic energy, I think, to play the role of a mediator. So the U.S. has been the star so far.
All right. So Germany's chancellor is visiting Israel. And how do you view the role of the European Union, the European nations in, mediating peace or providing support in this conflict?
I don't think the EU really hasn't ironed out its position yet. I mean, von der Leyen gave a very pro-Israel speech a week ago. But I think the EU more broadly, on the EU level, is much more balanced and has a lot of sympathy for the Palestinians, with the exception of Germany. Germany is a special case because of the Holocaust and because of Germany's ironclad support for Israel. I think even Germany is trying to play more of a balanced role here, but the Germans, and Germany is Europe's most important country. And I think the Germans will be much more forward-leaning on Israel. So overall, I think the EU is ex-Germany is migrating towards a more even-handed approach to the war. And Germany will join them, but still support Israel.
All right. So China has called for a ceasefire and a greater UN involvement. So what influence might China exert in bringing about a peaceful resolution, and how do these interests in the Middle East play into this?
China's influence in the Middle East has risen dramatically, but in the Gulf mostly, with Saudi Arabia, with the Emiratis, with the Emirates, in Bahrain. I think less so in the Levant. Chinese diplomacy, they did the same thing in the Ukraine war. They called for a ceasefire, but weren't helpful in implementing one. I think their diplomacy will be the same here. I think it will be, pretty standardized words flowing from the Global Security Initiative, which is Xi Jinping's big picture orientation towards the world. I think it'll be a lot of words. I don't think it'll be much action. I just don't. I just don't think that China has the diplomatic heft and contacts and detailed knowledge of the region. And boy, is it complicated. I used to work on it. You've got to be able to pull in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza, Egypt, Jordan. It just takes incredible diplomatic history and diplomatic heft. And I don't think China has that in the Middle East. So I don't think they'll be a big player.
Okay. So a lot of politicians across the world, especially in India, the opposition, they have like openly supporting Palestine. What do you have to say about that?
A lot of politicians across the global south,
Yeah.
a lot of leaders in the global south are openly supporting Palestine. Sympathy for Israel
Yes.
is much weaker, I think, in the global south. So it's a problem. It's a problem for, well, it's an opportunity and a problem, I guess, as a strict analyst. What it does is I think it keeps the U.S. honest. A big potential loss in this for the U.S. is kind of likely if there's lots of killing and the optics of on the street in Gaza are horrible. Any diplomatic comeback the U.S. has made in the global south will be either lost or severely diminished. And I think that's why the U.S. has pushed Israel to delay the land war.
Yeah.
Look, this country, the U.S., understands that we lost the global south. We lost the hearts and minds of the global south, generally diplomatically, but especially over the war in Ukraine, where the reaction was, this is a war in the north, this is your war. We are getting sanctions and higher food prices and higher energy prices, and we don't want it. Please end this war and end it now. And that was really a big hit in Washington diplomatically. The Biden administration really kind of got together and said, we got to do something better with the global south. And they did afterwards. I think that the U.S. vision of the G20, on MPP reform, on the global south agenda, the U.S. was very, very supportive. Well, now we're looking at a reaction from the global south, which would undo all of those gains that we made, I think, in the last 4, 5, 6 months. And that's a big deal. So that's what Blinken, I don't have an answer. But if we want an explanation for these crazy airplane trips, the Kissinger-like airplane trips that Blinken's taken across the region right now, across the Middle East, I think one of the main drivers is a realization that, like you just mentioned, in India, of key politicians supporting Palestine, that the U.S. has a thin gray line to walk, otherwise they're going to take a big loss. So it's a big deal.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
So much for watching this, guys.
For such fine news breaks and video features from ground on your mobile phones, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, The New Indian, by clicking on the bell icon. Also, follow us on the social media handles on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook and Co.